March 3, 1944, East Anglia, England. Lieutenant William Overstreet sat alone in his quarters, the low hum of generators outside blending with the distant roar of engines being tested. His pencil trembled slightly, not from fear, but from exhaustion, as he wrote to his sweetheart back in Virginia. "Tomorrow," he wrote, "we're doing something they all said was impossible, flying all the way to Berlin and back in a single-seat fighter." Through the frosted window, he could see ground crews working under harsh floodlights, fitting strange cylindrical objects beneath the wings of his P-51 Mustang. They looked almost comical, like oversized packages wrapped in brown paper, not the kind of thing you'd trust with your life. Some of the boys were jokingly calling them paper bags. When Overstreet asked if they were serious, his crew chief just laughed. "They're laminated paper and plastic resin, Lieutenant. Same stuff the Brits have been using. They'll hold long enough to get you there and back." What no one fully realized that night was that the mathematics of air warfare were about to be rewritten, not by thicker armor or stronger engines, but by compressed paper soaked in resin, made in an old newspaper factory. The crisis that led to this moment had begun months earlier, on October 14, 1943, a day forever remembered as Black Thursday at Hailworth Airfield. Colonel Hubert Zena stood grimly before the operations board as reports poured in like obituaries. 60 B-17s gone, 600 men lost in a single day. Of the 291 bombers that had taken off for Schweinfurt's ball-bearing factories, over a quarter never returned. The Luftwaffe had waited patiently, just beyond the range of the Thunderbolts, and when the American escorts turned back, the German fighters swarmed in. A ball turret gunner named Robert Morgan later recalled it with chilling clarity. "We were sitting ducks for 3 hours. Once the little friends turned back, Jerry came at us in waves." The P-47 Thunderbolt was a magnificent aircraft, but with its standard fuel tanks, it could only reach about 375 miles. Berlin was nearly twice that distance. In a quiet corner of the 8th Air Force's technical office at Boyington, a colonel named Cass Hoof was studying something that looked more like a school art project than a weapon of war, a fuel tank made entirely of paper. It was crafted from laminated craft paper bonded with resin, shaped over wooden forms, and sealed with fire-resistant lacquer. The design came from Bowater Lloyd, a British company that once printed the London Times. Aluminum was scarce, but paper was plentiful. What had started as Britain's solution to a material shortage was now becoming America's answer to a strategic crisis. These new drop tanks were feather-light, only 50 pounds empty compared to 150 for the metal kind. That meant more fuel, more range, and more possibilities. The first test came in February 1944. Major James Goodson of the 56th Fighter Group took his P-47 aloft with a pair of these strange silver-painted paper tanks. He returned from Hanover reporting they'd performed flawlessly. No leaks, no failures. The skeptics were silenced, at least for a moment. Then came the arrival of the P-51 Mustang, sleek, fast, and astonishingly efficient. It was the perfect partner for these new drop tanks. With two 108-gallon paper tanks beneath its wings, the Mustang's range suddenly leapt to 850 miles. And just like that, Berlin, once untouchable, was within reach. The morning of March 4th, 1944. Inside the briefing room at Debden Airfield, the noise slowly died until you could hear the ticking of a single clock. The map on the wall was covered in red grease pencil lines, and one of them stretched like a blade straight from East Anglia into the very heart of Germany. For the first time in history, single-engine fighters would escort the bombers all the way to Berlin and back. One pilot later said you could have heard a pin drop. Then someone just whispered, "Berlin." And everyone in that room knew that history was about to change. Outside, under the cold gray dawn, crew chiefs had been working since 3 a.m., filling the new paper tanks. They had to move fast. The gasoline would slowly eat through the resin after about 5 hours, but that was all the Mustangs needed. Each tank held exactly 108 gallons of high-octane fuel, 3 main parts, nose cone, tail cone, and the paper laminated body. They were hand-finished by women working in repurposed newspaper plants. These weren't factory-line mechanics. They were paper mill workers and artisans, people who understood texture and grain, now saving lives through their precision. When the first wave of Mustangs lifted off into the sky, no one knew whether the tanks would hold, but they did it perfectly. Over Berlin, Luftwaffe pilots couldn't believe their eyes. American fighters over their capital. German intelligence had sworn this was impossible. A ball turret gunner named Dale Rice of the 100th Bomb Group remembered looking up from his B-17 and seeing the gleaming contrails of Mustangs above. One pilot dipped his wings, he said, and I saw those paper tanks under them. That's when we knew we weren't alone anymore. From that day on, the air war over Germany would never be the same. In the months that followed, bomber losses plummeted. What had once been slaughter over Schweinfurt and Regensburg became sustainable missions. By May 1944, loss rates dropped from over 7% per month to barely 2%. Thousands of airmen lived because of a few hundred pounds of paper and glue. Republic aviation engineers soon realized these tanks had even more advantages. They caused less drag than metal tanks. When hit by gunfire, they didn't explode, they simply tore open and leaked. And after the war, farmers discovered they biodegraded into the soil, leaving behind only a few bits of metal fittings. The Germans tried to copy the idea, but their war economy was already collapsing. Paper mills were busy printing maps. Resin was going into aircraft construction, and the distributed home workshop manufacturing system the Allies used simply didn't exist in Germany. By the summer of 1944, the Luftwaffe was crumbling. German pilots were being sent into combat with barely 50 hours of flight time. Meanwhile, the Americans, now with paper-fed range, dominated the skies. Everywhere the Luftwaffe went, the Mustangs were already there, over airfields, railways, and even over Berlin itself. Fighter aces like Francis Gabby Gabreski and Don Gentile flew mission after mission with those same paper tanks, and they swore by their reliability. Gabreski's after-action report from July 1944 described perfect tank performance at -40 degrees and flawless release under combat stress. The tanks were now being produced by the tens of thousands. At Bowater Lloyd's newspaper plant, the same presses that once printed the London Times now churned out war supplies instead of headlines. Women worked 3 shifts a day, laminating, gluing, and sealing tanks that would only be used once, but whose single use could mean saving the lives of a 10-man bomber crew. As the Allies pushed deeper into France, the logistical miracle of these paper tanks became clear. They were cheap, light, and easy to ship flat. A single transport plane could carry hundreds of them. They could even be dropped by parachute to forward airfields, ready to fuel the next wave of fighters. By the time of D-Day, Allied aircraft were operating everywhere, from the beaches of Normandy to the outskirts of Paris. Thanks to those disposable tanks, Mustangs could launch 3 or 4 sorties a day and be re-equipped in under 20 minutes. The system worked flawlessly. Even captured German intelligence officers later admitted the truth. Major Wilhelm Hoffmann told his interrogators, "The paper tank changed everything. It meant nowhere in the Reich was safe from fighter attack." By late 1944, the situation inside Germany was collapsing. Fuel production was falling apart. Aircraft factories were being bombed daily. Fighter output dropped by 40%. But even the planes they built couldn't fly. There simply wasn't any fuel left. General Adolf Galland, the Luftwaffe's top ace, summed it up best after the war. When the Mustangs appeared over Berlin, the war was lost. The irony was almost poetic. An empire that built rockets and jet fighters undone by paper and glue. After the war, the influence of the paper drop tank didn't fade away. The lamination techniques developed for them became the foundation of early composite materials and even the first printed circuit boards. The same presses that once rolled newspaper tanks later produced television cabinets and aircraft panels. Wing Commander Peter Brothers of the RAF once said, "The British gave the Americans the idea. The Americans gave it mass production, and together they gave the bombers safe passage to Berlin." By the final months of the war, paper tanks were everywhere. More than 15,000 were dropped over Europe, disappearing into fields and forests, washed away by rain. Their contribution was quiet but decisive. By 1946, General James Doolittle summarized it best in his report to Congress. The extension of fighter range through the British-made paper tanks was the single most important tactical development of the air war in Europe. From a newspaper mill in Kent to the skies over Berlin, the story of the paper drop tank became a lesson in wartime ingenuity, a triumph of simplicity over complexity. Lieutenant William Overstreet, the young pilot who had written that letter to his sweetheart in Virginia, survived the mission. His Mustang returned safely that day, its paper tanks long gone, jettisoned somewhere over the German countryside. He never knew exactly where they fell, only that they had carried him farther than anyone had believed possible. Those tanks, cheap, temporary, almost laughable, had given the Allies what they needed most: reach. And that reach changed the course of the air war forever, proving once and for all that sometimes the simplest solutions, the ones born from necessity and scarcity, can carry within them the fuel for victory.